All right, here we go. Welcome, friends. Welcome to the next installment of The Wine Press and the next installment of the Gospel of the Skull Crusher Bible Study. This is now session 11. The title of this session is The Star from Jacob. So in last week's session, we began discussing the four oracles of the incredibly unusual, enigmatic prophet Balaam. This is a Gentile, pagan, seer for hire whom the Lord chose to use and speak through, despite his compromises, to declare some of the most foundational messianic prophecies in the entire Bible. And really, the overarching sort of lesson of all of this is in the same way that the Lord can speak literally through a donkey, in the same way that he can sovereignly open the mouth of a donkey and speak his word through the mouth of a donkey, so also can he speak through the lips of a pagan compromised prophet. And there's so many lessons here, obviously, that we don't have time to get into. But in this session, we're going to look at the last two oracles, Oracle 3 and 4, in which really the clearest, as I said, some of the clearest messianic prophecies in the entire Bible are made. In the first two oracles, Balaam is prophesying primarily about Israel. But then in these last two, he begins speaking specifically about the ultimate seed from Israel, the Messiah, of course, which is Jesus. So we've looked at Numbers 22 and 23. Now we're going to transition into Numbers 24. When Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he did not go as at other times to seek omens, but he set his face toward the wilderness or toward the desert. Now, this moment in the story, this really marks a profound turning point in the whole story of Balaam. And to be clear, I'm pivoting off of the work of a guy named Seth D. Postel. Seth is actually with the ministry One for Israel. If you're not familiar with One for Israel, it's a great ministry. They're there in Israel. I believe they're up in like the Netanya area-ish. And they produce all of the videos. Many of you have probably seen them. I Found Messiah. So they're videos of Jews that have come to faith in Jesus, and they share their testimonies often in Hebrew, some of them getting millions of views in Hebrew, again, in a state with roughly 8 million or even less Hebrew speakers. They're making a huge, huge impact. Great ministry. But beyond that, Seth is with One for Israel. Seth is a theologian, a real academic guy, deeply appreciate his work. But he contributed a chapter in the book, The Moody Handbook of Messianic Prophecy. And I really relied on that book quite a bit in the different resources that I was consulting when I wrote Gospel of the Skull Crusher. Seth contributed the article on Balaam. And, I've obviously consulted different commentaries, but his chapter is excellent. And the way that he frames it, and again, so I'm pivoting off of his work, is that when you look at sort of the literary structure of the book of Balaam, okay, so again, this little section within Numbers 22 through 24, the way that he frames it is you have, again, these parallels between Balaam's donkey and Balaam. 3 times Balaam's donkey is struck, and then the Lord opens his eyes. Similarly, 3 times Balaam is told, go curse Israel, and each time he doesn't, but it's at the 3rd time, which is right here, that in the same way that the donkey's mouth was open, now Balaam's eyes are opened. And what we'll see is the Spirit of the Lord actually comes upon him. So it's an amazing thing, and that the Lord chooses to use, again, a pagan prophet to speak his word, demonstrating that he is not simply the God of Israel, who only speaks through Israelite, children of Israel prophets. He can speak through anyone in the world that he wants, because he is, again, the sovereign God of the entire planet. So here again, when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, it's the Lord's will to bless Israel, according to what? His covenantal promises. And those are still applicable today, even if the majority of Israel is in unbelief, because God's promises are irrevocable. He did not go to seek omens as at other times. So in previous times, he would seek omens. On one hand, he would say, look, I can only say what God puts in my mouth. On the other hand, he was going saying, hey, maybe God will put something bad in my mouth. He would go and seek omens. Now, this is important because in highlighting the fact that Balaam was not a prophet of God. We see here in Deuteronomy 18, verse 10, in Torah, the Lord said, "There shall not be found among you anyone who makes a son or daughter pass through the fire, sacrificing their children to Molech, or one who uses divination, one who practices witchcraft, who interprets omens, or a sorcerer." So these are all things that Balaam clearly violated: seeking omens, divination for hire. I don't know that he was necessarily a witch, so to speak, but he clearly violated God's covenantal commandments to Israel. He was a pagan. And so this is where the oracle number 3 picks up. Numbers 24, verse 2. "So Balaam lifted up his eyes, and he saw Israel camping tribe by tribe." So Balaam is up again on this very high overlook on one of the high places of Baal, probably one of the high places of Baal. They had sacrificed all of these oxen or bulls and rams on the 7 altars, and he's looking down from this high place, and he sees Israel, the people of Israel, and they're divided according to their tribes. He sees them camping tribe by tribe. Now here it is. "And the Spirit of God came upon him." The Spirit of God came upon him and opened his eyes. So here it is. This is where the Lord is now speaking through a donkey, so to speak. "He took up his discourse and he said, 'The oracle of Balaam, son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened.'" Like there's no more question. The Spirit of the Lord is on him. His eye is opened. "The oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of Almighty, falling down, yet having his eyes uncovered." So again, no omens this time. No omens. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, and the Lord begins to speak through him. Verse 6, he says, "How fair are your tents." So again, he's looking down at the tribes of Israel, all divided up according to their tribes. He says, "How fair are your tents, O Jacob." It's a parallel. "Your dwellings, O Israel." Jacob, Israel. "Like valleys that stretch out, like gardens beside the river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters." So all of this language, again, clearly agricultural, paradisal type of language. The intention is to hearken back to Eden. He's looking at Israel, and they are a reflection of Eden. He's using hyperbolic, poetic language. And so Israel itself is a picture. It's a sort of preview, a prophetic preview of when God will ultimately restore all things and restore paradise. Verse 7, now here it is. "Water will flow from his buckets." Very reminiscent of your cup will overflow, you know. If your cup is full, may it be again. That's a line from a song that I love, but it's very similar to that. You know, my cup overflows, water flows from his buckets. And it actually harkens back. It reminds me of, we didn't look at to the portion when Jacob prophesies over his sons. We didn't look at the portion where he blesses Joseph. And I love the line. It's actually been one of my life verses where it says, "Joseph is a fruitful vine. His vines hang over the wall." You go, wait, what's that saying? So, you know, again, in the Middle East or throughout most of the world today, you know, you go to the Latin, Central America, most private pieces of property have a wall around it. You know, your yard, your piece of property, it has a wall. And so all of your vines, all of your property is within the walls. But in the case of Joseph, he is so blessed that his vines hang over the wall. In other words, someone just walking by can pick his grapes and enjoy some, like he's overflowing so much that he's able to bless others outside of his own sphere. And so Israel is like that. Their water they have all that they need in their own buckets, but it's flowing out to others. It is a nation that is a nation not of consumers, but of givers. And this is really what we're called to be. And so as you have this prophetic language of the restoration of all things, the people of the restoration are likewise a generous, giving people whose blessings overflow to the nations. That's sort of the idea. "And his seed will be by many waters." So here is the language of the seed, Israel's seed. This has been the consistent theme from the beginning, from the proto-evangelion. Right? "I'll create enmity between your seed and his seed. His seed is going to get crushed. The seed of the serpent is going to get crushed. The seed of Eve will crush the serpent's head. Later we learn that it's the seed also of Abraham. It's the seed from the line of Shem. And then it's ultimately going to be the line here of Israel. And then later we'll see that it's from the line of David. It's the line of Judah. It's the line of Israel. And ultimately the line of David. His seed will be by many waters. Right now, I just planted a bunch of grass seed to some of the bare spots in my yard. You have to keep it watered every day. Otherwise, it will die. Water and seeds go well together, especially grass seed. So here's a seed that is well nourished. Again, it's just language of prosperity. And his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. So here you have these two incredibly important motifs of the seed and the king of Israel. Thoroughly blessed. It's conveying language that speaks of the restoration of all things. And then you have this very unusual statement. His king, the king of Israel, will be higher than Agag. Now, this statement has been the source of incredible controversy because a lot of people go, what in the world does this mean? What does it mean that the king of Israel will be exalted above Agag? Agag was a king of the Amalekites that later in the biblical narrative, after Israel enters the land and the kingdom of David is developed, then, well, actually it's before the kingdom of David, Saul, okay, so just before David, defeats the Amalekites, and Agag is the king of the Amalekites. Now he's told to completely wipe them out because the Amalekites were among the corrupted giant clans. I've actually shared, I have a video, I should throw it in here, where when I go to Saudi Arabia, there are some paintings one painting that I found, and then right next to it, this kid that was with me at the time, 14, he's now probably 21, found this other painting that's about literally 20 yards from the first painting, and it appears to portray, again, images of Israel fighting against giants. Now we know within the biblical narrative that Israel fought the Amalekites as part of the Exodus, and so it's very possible that we actually found pictographic evidence of Israel fighting the Amalekites or giants right at the base of Mount Sinai. Really fascinating stuff, but in my opinion, it gets even more fascinating, and actually it's Seth Postel that highlights this. I had not heard this before, and it was my friend Travis Snow. Many of you know Travis, actually pointed this out to me a couple of years ago, and I found it really, really fascinating because I've done a lot of work. For those of you who have followed me, I've done a lot of work on Ezekiel 38 and 39, the oracle of Gog-Magog, and it's the intertextuality, like other passages in the Bible that relate to it. Well, interestingly enough, in this oracle here where it says, his king shall be exalted above Agag. Okay, now this gets a little technical. So everyone watching this, your English Bibles that you read, if you're reading an English Bible, I know there's a lot of people here who read from other countries, but in all of the mainstream English translations, they are translating from the Masoretic family of texts, the Masoretic Hebrew family of texts. So these are roughly 1000 AD, from the medieval period. We have much, much older Hebrew texts, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, such as the Samaritan Pentateuch. And then we also have 3 early Greek translations of the Old Testament in the 1st century, Symmachus, Aquila, and Theodotion. Those 3 are very difficult for your average non-scholar to access. They're not made widely available to a popular audience. On the other hand, the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are much more accessible. Now, here is what is fascinating, is that in all six of these very much older manuscript testimonies, so to speak, all of them don't have Agag. They all have a bit of a textual variant there, so they're all a little bit different, but they all have Gog. Not Agag, but Gog. So instead of saying that the king and the seed of Israel will be exalted above Agag, the king of the Amalekites, which basically doesn't make any sense. This is the problem, is people go, why would the Messiah be exalted above Agag, who's a king that Saul defeated. Like it just doesn't make sense. However, if by looking at again the early manuscript witnesses, we say, oh, it's a textual variant, which is to say that in the Masoretic family of texts, Gog later became changed to Agag. Someone along the line changed it, and the earlier manuscript witnesses are actually the correct originals. And so the original prophecy, Balaam was saying that the king of Israel will be exalted above Gog. Now we just have to step back here for a minute. Remember, the story that we're tracing is the story of the two seed lines, the seed line of the righteous and the seed line of the serpent. The entire biblical narrative is the story of the battle, the unfolding conflict between these two seed lines. And the ultimate Messiah, the ultimate seed, will come out of the righteous line, and then out of the unrighteous line, the ultimate seed of the unrighteous line is the Antichrist. This is the first verse in the Bible that names the Antichrist. It doesn't call him the Antichrist. This is just what Christians call him. It's the most popular name. But the best, most common Old Testament name for the final dictator, the final bad guy, the final satanic seed is Gog. The king of Israel will be exalted above Gog. He will be exalted above the Antichrist. Antichrist is just the most popular Christian term, but that is one of many different names and titles that is used for the final adversary, the final human adversary, the final human sock puppet of the serpent of Satan. So that is a really fascinating part of the prophecy. It's in fact, one of the most important takeaways of the prophecy. The overwhelming, consistent 6 different early witnesses all say that the proper translation or the proper name here is Gog, not Agag. And so here we have the first actual reference to the final seed of the serpent. And then that gives us tremendous insight into Ezekiel 38 and 39. Is that that's just talking about the Antichrist. Ezekiel 38 and 39, in so many ways, it is probably the most towering, most important, most foundational Old Testament passage that speaks about the Antichrist, other than Daniel 11. You could say Daniel 8 and 11 and some of the passages in Daniel, but really Daniel 8, 11, Ezekiel 38 and 39, those are the most important that talk about the Antichrist. And he's called Gog. And really, if you look at the interpretations of the rabbis today, they say Gog umagog. They all will say that Gog is the final bad guy, that the Messiah will come, basically defeat and then reestablish the state of Israel. So, I mean, their story, if we understand that Gog is the Antichrist, it absolutely makes complete sense. Absolutely makes complete sense. Many within the prophecy world say that Gog is a different end-time bad guy. It's a different coalition of nations, blah, 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 blah. We will get into that in much more detail later. But it actually causes tremendous problems and contradictions within the story if you have Gog as a different end-time bad guy other than the Antichrist. If you make him the same, everything falls into alignment and it all makes sense. And it aligns with passages like this. And then it says, God brings him out of Egypt. He is for him like the horns of a wild ox. Now, if you remember in last week's session, this exact statement was made, except it was made in one of the earlier oracles, specifically about Israel. So in Numbers 23, verse 22, it says, God brings them out of Egypt. Balaam is looking at Israel. They're coming up out of Egypt, out of the Exodus. He says God brings them out of Egypt. He is for them like the horns of a wild ox. And then here in Numbers 24, verse 8, he says God brings him out of Egypt. This is a great example where the people of Israel, okay, they have promises. They're part of the Abrahamic covenant, but the ultimate fulfillment is the Messiah within them, the ultimate representative. And so it's at times you can be looking at Israel and a passage will just bleed into talking about the Messiah and so on and so forth. Sometimes they all collapse together as if they're one individual. This is the nature of biblical Hebrew prophetic poetry because they are all essentially one and the same, but yet they're not. And so the Lord, oftentimes, they'll just sort of blend them, or as I said, collapse them all together into one entity. Verse 8, he will devour the nations who are his adversaries, and he will crush their bones in pieces. There you absolutely have the skull crusher language, the conqueror, the victorious one, and he will shatter them with his arrows. This is actually language that we later will see in Habakkuk chapter 3, which is one of the most majestic, beautiful chapters in the Old Testament that talks about the return of Jesus. He will shatter them with his arrows. So here you have the language. It's ultimately prophesying about Jesus, about the Messiah at the end of the age. He will devour the nations who are his adversaries. For all of our amillennialist friends who don't believe that Jesus is going to literally come back, defeat his enemies, I say, when was this verse fulfilled? When will this verse be fulfilled? When was this fulfilled? When has Jesus devoured the nations who are his adversaries as the King of Israel? It's never happened. And you can't just reduce this to saying, well, what this means is he subdues the nations by making them his children. He defeats them by winning their hearts. Like this type of thing. It's amazing and yet really frustrating when you look at the way that our amillennialist Christian brothers and sisters, they think they can just wave a magic wand over so many, just such an abundance of clear Old Testament passages that clearly say things that if you just read it at face value, you go, okay, this king is going to devour, he's going to defeat, conquer the nations who are his enemies. And they think they can just wave a magic wand over that and say, it doesn't mean that. It just means blessings in Christ. Like they can take words that mean things and just make them go away by just saying, oh, these are all just things that we're just going to spiritually inherit, and it's all just about blessings in Jesus, and we're living these things out right now. You go, that's not what it says. That is not what it says. He will crush their bones in pieces. Again, the skull crusher, the title, it's so strange. It's so offensive to so many people. Yet, as I said, this theme of Jesus as the crushing one, as the victorious divine warrior, it is the single most consistent theme or motif that describes him throughout the entire Bible. It is the most consistent adjective or descriptive of him in the entire Bible, over and over and over again. He is the crushing one. He will crush. This is talking about Jesus. He will crush his adversaries' bones in pieces. When? When he returns. When he returns and he treads the winepress of the wrath of God Almighty. Again, he will shatter them with his arrows. Verse 9. He couches. He lies down as a lion. This is language we're familiar with. As a lion, who dares to rouse him? Directly quoting, here's Balaam, 240 years after Jacob died, after Jacob had said these very words to his son Judah, after he had spoken by the Spirit of God and prophesied over his son Judah. Here, 240 years later, a pagan prophet speaks the very same words. Did Balaam know about the prophecy of Jacob? Had he ever heard it? Is it possible? It's possible. Or was this just pure revelation? We don't really know. And then he actually directly quotes the Abrahamic covenant. Blessed is everyone who blesses you, and cursed is everyone who curses you. So here he's obviously speaking of the Messiah. He directly looks back and draws back from the prophecy, the blessing of Jacob, and then he goes even further and goes to the Abrahamic covenant. Isn't it amazing how here in the prophecy of Balaam, he ties together, again, this golden thread of messianic prophecy as it grows and develops and expands, and the intertextuality where Balaam is going back and drawing from the previous blessings and covenants, and he weaves them all together into this masterful poetic prophecy. I just love it. Verse 10 through 11. Then Balak. Again, Balak here is the seed of the serpent in this narrative. He's the type of Pharaoh. His anger burns against Balaam, and he struck his hands together. And Balak says to Balaam, I called you to curse my enemies. I told you to curse them, but behold, you have persisted in blessing them 3 times. 3 times I told you to curse them, but then what happened? The Spirit of the Lord came on him. His eyes were opened. Therefore, flee to your place now. I said I would honor you greatly. I said I would honor you, but behold, the Lord has held honor back from you. It's not because he's changing his mind and he doesn't want to give up all of his money and break his promise. That's exactly what he was doing. He blames God. He goes, God chose not to honor you. Balak sounds like a narcissist, typical narcissist. Numbers 24, 12 through 14. And then Balaam responds to Balak. Hell yeah. Listen, did I not tell your messengers? Like, how many times was I not clear? Whom you sent to me, saying, though Balak would give you his whole house full of silver and gold, I could not do anything contrary to the command of the Lord. Balaam, he goes, I made it very clear to you. I'm not going to come out here and make something happen if the God of heaven doesn't make it happen, either good or bad, on my own accord. When the Lord speaks, that I will speak. And then he goes, and now, because you're such a jackwad, because you're such a jerk, he goes, behold, now here it comes. I am going to go back to my people and come. I'm about to tell you what this people, he points to Israel, are going to do to your people in the days to come. In the days to come. Now, I quote this in the Hebrew many, many times. I've said it many times. It's the Hayamim Achrit. Oftentimes I'll say Achrit, Hayamim. I often mix around the adjectives and the nouns. It's the days, plural, of the last days. It's the last days. It's a very common phrase, again, among the modern rabbis that are very familiar with this. Every time in Moses that this phrase is used, it's always referring to a very distant period, at the very least past the time of David, but it's ultimately referring to the last days. Again, all the way back here at the time of the Exodus, any time past David is like the distant future, but consistently in Genesis 49, verse 1, Deuteronomy 4, verse 30, Deuteronomy 31, verse 29, this phrase, Hayamim Achrit, always refers to the last days. So again, let's just go back. Balaam says, I am going to tell you what Israel is going to do to the Moabites, and he was also partnered with the Midianites in the last days. So he's now speaking of a last days, end time battle or conflict. And it's the Messiah, but yes, again, it's also Israel. And so now we go to the fourth oracle. So the third oracle just kind of naturally bleeds right into the fourth oracle. And the third and the fourth, they're almost one and the same. But he goes through the whole rigmarole of, the sort of warm-up before he speaks the oracle. He took up his discourse, Numbers 24, verse 15. He took up his discourse and he said, the oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eyes opened. Again, his eye is now opened. The oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High and sees the vision of the Almighty falling down, yet having his eyes uncovered. So he always has to go through the big rigmarole. And, as I said, it always reminds me of in the Middle East, again, Arabs, they have all of these wonderful, beautiful greetings, and there's a specific word for it, I forget, but when they greet each other, it goes on sometimes for a few minutes. How are you, my most beautiful friend, my wonderful, how is your most beautiful family? Come, my friend, everything is mine, is yours, it all belongs to me. If you want to burn my whole house down and eat all my food, it all belongs to you. Oh, it's so good. You know what I mean? It kind of goes on and on and on. In the ancient Near East, it seems like whenever a prophet would prophesy, they would begin with all of this. The prophet who sees the visions of God, whose eyes are open, he hears the words of the watchers and this sort of thing. And it's very similar to what we see in the book of Enoch. Enoch does the exact same thing. It's very similar to Balaam, and we actually see it later in the blessing of Moses. Moses himself also does this. Moses, the man of God, he refers to, they give their credentials first before they give their prophecy. It's like, and here is the reasons why what I'm about to say are valid and have credibility. But I want you to notice something here. So in verse 17, he says, I see him, but not now. So now he begins launching into the oracle. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. So this is very specific language where he begins talking about a him. This reminds me of the proto-evangelion. You know, the Lord says, like, I'm going to create enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. And then he just says, he is going to crush your head. You go, he? Who's this he? Where did he come from? Similarly here, he just says, I see him. I see him. I behold him. Who? He's talking about the seed and the king of Israel. He's talking about the seed of the woman. He's talking about the skull crusher. But he is far off in the distance. Again, he had just said, Hayamim Achrit, the last days. He goes, I see him, but he is way, way off in the distance. Now, this is very similar to what he had said earlier. And we highlighted this last week in Numbers 23, verse 9. He's speaking of Israel, and he says, I see him from the top of the rocks. I look at him from the hills. Presently, at the moment, he goes, I see Israel right now. With my eyes, I see him from the top of the rocks. But with regard to the Messiah, he goes, I see him, but he is far off. He's in the distance. So Balaam is the first of the prophets that doesn't just tell the story of what's coming about, someone who's going to crush the head of the serpent. He's going to reverse the curse. He's going to renew all things. He's going to be the king of Israel. Balaam is the first prophet that places all of these things in the last days. Balaam is the one that begins sort of framing out what I'll call Jewish apocalyptic framework or a Jewish apocalyptic worldview, which is the biblical worldview, which says that you have this age and the age to come. Okay, the Olam Haba. Last time I think I said Olam, I don't know, whichever. I always crisscross them. It's the age to come, the age of the Messiah. So Balaam begins framing out, again, the biblical or Jewish apocalyptic framework for understanding the overarching narrative of the Bible. So there it is, verse 17. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will rise from Jacob. A scepter shall rise from Israel. Another parallelism. A star shall rise from Jacob. A scepter shall rise from Israel. Now, a scepter is clearly referring to a king. The star is speaking of heavenly glory and, sort of this exalted, almost divine status. A star, a glorious one, will rise up out of Israel, and a scepter. Now, watch this. And it shall crush. There's the language again, the crushing one, the skull crusher. It shall crush through the forehead of Moab. So Balaam says, come now, I'm going to tell you what the Jews, what the Hebrews, what the Israelites are going to do to your people in the last days. And then he says, in the last days, a star will rise up out of Israel, and that scepter is going to be thrust through the very forehead of Moab. We're going to see this theme of skulls being crushed throughout the biblical narrative, but this is clearly using all of the skull crusher language. Now the Lord is not simply saying he's going to crush the head of the Antichrist. Now the Lord begins actually in the same way that he's been tracing the righteous line largely through the line of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Judah, right? And then ultimately David. Not only is he tracing that righteous line through the promised line, now he begins naming the unrighteous seed line. And it's the enemies of Israel. Whoever are the enemies of Israel, whether, again, it's Pharaoh or Moab, any of these pagan kings, they are now framed as the seed of the serpent. In other words, it's no longer just someone's coming who's going to crush the head of Satan. Now he starts naming the children of Satan's by name. He starts naming them. And because Moab in this narrative are the enemies of God, are the enemies of Israel, God says in the last days, Israel is going to defeat the people of Moab. Who are the people of Moab? Now, this is where the intersection of biblical prophecy and modern geopolitics becomes very, very sensitive, because we can say clearly the people in the land of Israel are Israel, despite all of the morons out there in the social media podcasting space. Yes, the people of Israel in the land are absolutely Israel. We won't get into all of that. But who is Moab? Well, Moab are essentially, and this is where we want to be careful, it's not about saying it's the Jordanians, it's central Jordan, although that is the region. And many of the people there are probably, partially descendants of Moab and Esau, and that's, they've all kind of intermixed over the years. But the real issue is the spiritual issue. And this is why I want to steer away from identifying it with any national people or any ethnic people. That's never the main focus of the prophecies. The issue is the people who are the enemies of Israel and who have that spirit. Now, could it correlate to Jordan? Absolutely. Could it correlate to some issues in Jordan? Absolutely. But the ultimate issue is not just, well, you're Jordanian, you're under judgment. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The issue is those who are the enemies of God, God's people, and God's promised plan. And he says those people will have their heads crushed when the seed in the king of Israel comes back. He will tear down all of the sons of Sheth. What is Sheth? Now the Septuagint there says the sons of Seth, which is interesting because you go, well, wait a minute, Seth would have been the righteous line. Others say that Sheth basically means the sons of the east or the sons of violence and tumult, which would be, like Hamas, the sons of violence. Hamas actually, what's amazing is Hamas actually means violence in Hebrew. The very word Hamas in Hebrew is violence. And then it says, now here's Edom, which is the kingdom just to the south of Moab, and they're the cousins of the Moabites. It says, in that day, Edom will become a possession. So Edom, which was, again, the southern kingdom, southern Jordan, still today, that same region, it will become a possession of Israel and the people of Israel under the king of Israel. Seir, which is the chief mountain or the capital of Edom, again, his enemies also will become a possession. While throughout this time, Israel will perform valiantly. This is very, very interesting. In some of the passages that speak of the last days, you have Israel being occupied, being defeated, houses being rummaged through, people dividing spoil, Zechariah 12 through 14, Joel chapter 3, all of these passages. You've got all of these devastating passages about Jacob's trouble, but then you have other passages that say that Israel will fight valiantly, that the Lord will use them as fire and all the nations as kindling wood. Israel will do valiantly, but ultimately, not just Israel on their own, Israel under the leadership of their king. Here it is again. One from Jacob shall have dominion, and he will destroy the remnant from the city. The Septuagint says he will kill all of those that are fleeing the city. In other words, the remnant, the few that are left that are trying to get out, he'll kill them too. In other words, he's going to completely wipe out all of his enemies in totality. So the idea here is a king, for the first time, it's really like crystal clear. He is a king that's going to rule the entire earth. He is a king that's going to defeat all of his enemies. He is a vicious, really a vicious, or I should say vicious, a thoroughly victorious king that will absolutely destroy and crush all of his enemies. I shouldn't say vicious because vicious, it sounds negative, but the reality is justice, when it's complete, looks brutal, and it looks vicious. But apart from a thorough victory and justice, the world does not make sense. In a world where injustices remain, that is a world of chaos. A world that is free of injustices is a world of order and beauty. And, everything is in order. And so he will, peace cannot reign until the enemies of God are subdued. And then he continues, and this is sort of almost like the aftermath of the oracle. Numbers 24, verses 20 through 25. And then he looked at Amalek. So he's just spoken a judgment oracle over Moab, over Sheth, over Edom, Mount Seir. And then he looks at Amalek, and he took up his discourse. So this is almost a fifth oracle, but it's really still part of the fourth. And he says, Amalek was the first among the Gentiles, but his end shall be destruction. And then he looked at the Kenites. And the Kenites are, again, part of the cousins. Later we'll see that Jael, who kills Sisera, she was a Kenite, but she was a friendly. And it's always important to note that, just because you're from some tribe or nation where there are clear judgment oracles in scriptures doesn't mean that everyone from that country is bad. Anybody, you can be a child of Abraham and still be a child of Satan. It doesn't matter where you come from. It's about how you live and act and so forth. But he takes up the the cause of the Kenites, and he says, your dwelling place is enduring, and your nest is set in the cliff. Now, what's interesting is the Kenites lived in the region of Mount Seir, which is basically modern-day Petra. So the ancient Edomites, the Kenites, all lived there in the same region. And then later, you had the Nabateans, the Arab kingdom that lived in the region of Petra. And as you go back there today, you see all of the caves, the buildings, the houses carved in the rocks. He says, your dwelling place is, your nest is in the cliffs. Nevertheless, Cain will be consumed. How long will Ashur keep you captive? Ashur is Assyria, but it's very ancient, very, very ancient Assyria. The Septuagint is very similar with some mild variations. Verse 23, alas, Balaam says, alas, who will survive? This really is kind of an eschatological prophecy, and admittedly, there's some things in here that are difficult for me to really understand what the Lord is saying. He says, who will survive whenever God sets things in place? Woe, 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 the day of the Lord. Who can endure the day of the Lord? Who will survive? Once the Lord brings order out of the chaos that we create, the purging of the fire, who can survive? And then he says, one will come forth from the hand of Kittim and will subjugate Assyria. This is where it gets difficult. What is Kittim? The Kittim, it's a term and a concept that develops biblically. Kittim, most scholars believe, originally referred to Cyprus, the large island of Cyprus today that's divided between the Greeks and the Turks. Northern and southern Cyprus, half of it is Greek, half of it is Turkish, okay? The Turks ultimately want to take it all back, but it was originally Cyprus, and they were a seafaring people. But ultimately, later it came to be viewed as the Romans, or actually later came to be viewed as just the Western powers of Greece and the Romans. And so in Daniel chapter 11, verse, I believe it's 29, it says, it talks about the ships of Kittim coming, and it actually talks about the Kittim in the book of Maccabees quite a bit, as well as it's a pretty common theme even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they all believe that it's basically speaking of Rome. You could say the Western European powers. So we can understand what it was in ancient times, but then we go, what does it mean in the last days? Some believe it's referring to the Western powers. Some specifically believe it's referring to the United States, that it's referring to the American powers, the ships of Kittim. And that's, by extension, you could kind of say that. But here it is, that someone from Kittim will subjugate Assyria, modern-day Iraq. You go, well, you've had the United States, Gulf Wars, the defeat of Iraq. Is it talking about that? Is it talking about something else? And then it says, and he will afflict the Hebrews, or Eber. So on one hand, whoever this Kittim is, they conquer Assyria, but they also seem to afflict the Hebrews. So you go, how could that be Europe or the United States? Now, here's the thing. Again, in Daniel, it was referring to the Romans. Again, we know the whole story that unfolded. Antiochus Epiphanes was from the Seleucid dynasty, basically in modern-day Turkey. He was in conflict with the Ptolemies, which were down in Egypt. And as he's coming down, I don't even remember which Caesar it was, but he sends ships. And you have the famous story where he draws a line in the sand around Antiochus Epiphanes, and he says, if you cross this line, it's on like Donkey Kong. And then ultimately Antiochus gets enraged and turns his anger against Israel, and he ends up invading Israel. So a real famous story, that's outside of the Bible, but it very much affects the biblical narrative. So their ships of Kittim are the Romans, are Europeans, but it's really hard to go, but if this is saying in the last days, someone from Kittim will defeat Assyria, but also afflict the Hebrews, do you go, is this the United States? Are they going to turn on Israel? Or, now get this, or is Kittim referring to Turkey? And you go, how would it refer to Turkey? Again, Turkey it's north, but it's kind of right on the line of east-west. It's, again, pushing toward Europe. And if they are the ones that control Cyprus now, then could it be that it's basically saying, which the king of the north, the Antichrist, is from the from the Seleucid dynasty, Asia Minor, modern day Turkey? Is it possible that Turkey will conquer Assyria, which is basically what they did with Syria, and then eventually they'll invade and occupy Israel? Well, that's basically what the Bible teaches. So it's hard to understand exactly what Kittim is, what it's intended to be here in the biblical narrative, versus what it came to mean in sort of Hebrew apocalyptic popular views in the Dead Sea Scrolls. How much do we rely on what was commonly believed by the Essenes in the Dead Sea Scroll community? It's a difficult one. And rising up, Balaam departed, or actually it says they themselves will all be destroyed together. So whoever Kittim is, they will be judged. So whoever it's referring to, whether it's Turkey or the United States, whoever it is, it says they will ultimately also be judged and destroyed. And then finally, rising up, Balaam departed, returning to his own territory, and then Balak also returned to his own place. So I'm going to end it right there. Just an absolutely fascinating deposit of messianic prophecy in so many ways. So many new little pieces have been added to the narrative. But really, for the first time, you have someone who, again, 240 years after the last deposit, which was the blessing of Jacob to Judah, 240 years later, the Lord uses a pagan prophet to give us really a summary and an expansion of everything that had come before. Still in Torah, still in the books of Moses. And next week, we're going to begin looking at Deuteronomy 18 and the prophet greater than Moses, which is an absolutely amazing prophecy. It's a little bit controversial or a little bit debated among scholars. Is it a messianic prophecy or is it not? Absolutely it is. But still here in Torah, we already have so much of the gospel itself, or the biblical narrative itself, the overarching story, it's already laid out. It's already laid out. And the reason that I want to continue to review the story from the beginning, as I've said, is because it inoculates us against all of the bad ideas that have crept into the church that are still so common in the church. When we see what the promises are, we either, one, say, well, God said all of those things, but he didn't really mean them. He meant something else, spiritual, completely different than the words he actually spoke and used. Or we say, I believe that God is going to do what he said. That those who heard these things understood them. Of course, they're poetic. Of course, there's hyperbole, all of these things. But simply because something is poetic, that is not the opposite of literal. It's using poetry to describe very literal physical realities. When he says land, he means land. Like, it doesn't mean just joy. You know, it could mean joy in the land. But if it says land, it means land. And this is important because we're dealing with the nature of language and how to understand language. And the ways that we understand language every day in the normal world, it doesn't change when we get to the Bible. The ways that we interpret language every day when you're walking around, talking to your friends, talking to your family, going to the grocery store, those same patterns of communication and interpreting language still apply when we're in the Bible. We don't suddenly get to the Bible and things that are literal suddenly are just spiritualized and symbolic and don't mean what they say. That's not how it works. Surely there's poetry, surely there's symbol, surely there's metaphor in the Bible. But it's not okay to take things which are intended to be understood literally and interpret them as metaphor. It's just not okay. So amen and amen. I'm going to end right there. As I said, next week we're going to jump into the prophet greater than Moses. So God bless you all. Have a fantastic week. Maranatha.